It was cruel of you to stand at my door and take my hand. Like a drowning man, I clung to my defenses. 10 years is a time, but your looks, love, it's a crime. And I lost my tongue in the tangle of my senses.
Ed Vane, Purple is his name.
I see.
Yeah, and he gives the story in detail.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Jeffrey Smith, and welcome to another interview in a series of interviews called Subterranean Homesick Missoula. We're lucky today to have a person visiting from Alberta, Canada, Louis Schmidtroth. And Louis is a person who has, from the very beginnings of his life in southwestern Montana, around the town of Bannock, has been interested in Montana history. His father owned the bakery in Dillon, right? And came out with a bread called Vigilante bread early on. And for a long time in Montana, our history has been of that Western myth of the black hats and the white hats, the good and the bad, you know, the good people deciding that there's a lawlessness afoot and having to put to death the bad people. And as we get further and further from that history, that original history in Virginia City and Bannock, a kind of a gray is descending on that black hats and white hats history. There's kind of a revisionism that's coming in right now. And Louis has done a lot of work investigating, and he has some interesting things to say about Montana's first sheriff, Henry Plummer, and Boone Helm, who was hanged from the Hangman's Building in Virginia City, and the vigilantes in Montana who hanged 21 different men in space of a month during December 1863 and January 1864. So welcome, Louis. Tell me.
Thanks, Jeff.
Tell me a little bit about being born and raised in the cradle of Montana history.
Well, my mother's father was a hard rock miner, Louis Stahl. There are lots of Louis in the family.
Uh-huh.
He moved out to the town of Argenta in the 1880s because that's where there was employment. Mm-hmm. Later, he moved his family over to Bannock. There was a second go-around in mining in Bannock in the 90s, and I think it was about 1895 that he moved the family over there, and that's where my mother was born, in the town of Bannock, in one of the original cabins of the old town site. And she was always very proud of having been born in Montana's first territorial capital. And of course, growing up in Dillon and environments, I spent a great deal of time in the mountains. I spent time prospecting with my uncle and other prospectors up in those mountains as a young man. And so I got to know the country very well. And of course, you heard the stories of the desperados, and especially of Henry Plummer. And I'd say one of the things I always heard was the version of his capture, which was making the rounds, where the vigilantes came to his cabin, and he was to pick him up.
And this was in Bannock?
This was in Bannock on January 10th, 1863, a Sunday. And in the evening, they came to his cabin. This is the Langford version of the capture of Plummer. To pick him up, and he was just finishing washing. And he was drying himself, and he said, "Gentlemen, wait till I finish, and I will get my coat and go with you." And of course, unbeknownst to the vigilantes in this version, he had a gun, a revolver hidden in his coat, and And of course, if he had reached that, he was such a fast draw, he would have killed all the vigilantes and escaped, right? Well, that version by Nathaniel Langford is cut out of whole cloth. It's all just a lie. And Langford probably knew it. It has been completely verified by undeniable sources that he was, in fact, at his sister-in-law's, Martha Vale. Henry Plummer was a married man. He was at his sister-in-law's, resting on the couch when the knock came, and he had no suspicion that there was any action against him. And so I didn't learn this until much later.
Okay, and so the original histories that you were told, the stories that came down to you, in later life you decided were not accurate. You started. But let's talk a little bit about where you went from being raised in the Dillon area. You were a veteran of World War II.
Yes, I spent 3 years in the Army in World War II, ended up in the Philippines. I have to say, however, that I neither shot anybody nor did anybody shoot me, but it was close.
That's good.
And
and then after your service, you went on for a PhD in mathematics.
I did a PhD at Stanford University in mathematics, and then I spent a year at Harvard as a postdoctoral fellow there in mathematics. Came back to dear old Missoula, which I love dearly. I think is one of the most beautiful places in the world. I roamed it around today, and even a tear came to my eye.
Oh, good. Good.
Well,
it's a beautiful day.
It's a beautiful day,
October.
And a beautiful campus, and I remember the fall of '56 when I arrived here for the first time. Things have changed dramatically since then, but nonetheless.
Well, welcome back.
Thank you very much.
And then from there you went to MSU?
Well, I did a lot of different things. I had an academic career, and I finally decided that I would drop out in the 70s and go farming, which I did. And then I went back into academic life in Canada, where I was farming, and joined a distance education university. After I retired from that, I then spent some time in Dillon visiting, and I wandered into a bookstore, and I happened to see this book. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, we can.
You can see this.
Get a close-up of
this
that
book. This is titled "Hanging the Sheriff: A Biography of Henry Plummer." I bought it, read it, and I just, was impressed with several things. One was that the exquisite, almost over attention to documentation. These people have spent 20 years studying the vigilantes and the gold camp situations. Right?
And Ruth, too, was born and raised in the Bannock area.
No, she wasn't.
That's not right?
No, she wasn't.
I thought she was.
No, she was. She was actually born in North Idaho.
Oh.
She has Montana roots, though.
Okay.
At any rate, then I decided that I found out that this book went through two printings, but is now out of print. So it's really not available. So I decided, being a computer scientist, that I would undertake to put some of this literature on the internet. And that is what I'm up to right now.
Okay. Was that the moment that you started reevaluating all your childhood stories about the vigilantes, or had you come to that point before?
No, it was after I read this book, and I wanted to check this out with some Montana historians. And so I approached a friend of mine who I grew up with, who I knew in kindergarten even, right, and had went all through school with, who is a PhD historian. And I opened up the subject with him. What about the evidence here that, for example, that there was no Plummer gang, and that Henry Plummer therefore could not have been the leader of a gang if it didn't exist? He was very rude. He didn't listen to me. He told me the best thing I could do would be to go back to Canada.
Huh.
And that was the end of it. And I said, well, so it started to dawn on me that there's a certain amount of closed-mindedness among the historian community of Montana. Not all, perhaps, but it certainly in some cases exists. And I wondered why. Then I made some other acquaintances, such as Mark Weber of Twin Bridges. And I found out that there's another side to the story. There is a whole movement even in Montana. There's quite a group of people who don't care to perpetuate the myths anymore.
Right.
They would rather see the light.
What I really like about it is that we tend to think of history as what's in the books, and that the books are something that we shouldn't challenge. I mean, going through school, we're not taught that history is an open thing and a moving thing, and different modern historians will reinterpret the past in different ways, that there'll be new information or new puzzle pieces will be found, and that the history is not closed. It's very much open, and that excitement that you talk about in finding out new things or asking new questions is what I really like about this whole process.
Right, I agree. You only have a limited number of sources, and you have the two main, the original Dimsdale version of what happened during the vigilante episodes, and then you have the much later written version of Nathaniel Langford, who, however, was there in Bannock and Virginia City, although he didn't participate in the hangings. He was gone to Washington on business at that time. But, nonetheless, he knew that many of the characters, so he has, you'd think, has a certain validity to his writing.
Nathaniel Langford was there in, what, early 1863, wasn't it? Or was it late 1862? He arrived
Langford,
at the Fisk expedition.
He arrived with the Fisk expedition, which was the summer of 62.
Was it 62? Okay.
He was already there in the fall of 62 when there was a funeral of a Mason, the very first Masonic rites funeral in Montana. In what is now Montana. It was Idaho at the time, by the way. You have to
this
keep
is
that in
Idaho
mind.
territory.
This was Idaho territory, right? And but Langford was there and officiated at the Masonic rites funeral, and there were 76 Masons present, and then additionally there was the deceased. So there were 77 altogether.
That description in his book is really interesting because he talks about being out away from the town and looking back at the town and talking about how there was a force of numbers of fellow Masons who were all participating in this ceremony, and looking back toward Bannock itself that was, in his descriptions anyway, was filled with lawlessness and filled with gamblers and murderers. And for the first time, I think it clicked in his mind that there was an opposing force there, or the ability to bring order to what he considered a lawlessness using the Mason Brotherhood, right?
That's possible. I'm not really an expert in that aspect of the history. Langford was certainly a law and order man, and he did in fact serve on the first jury to be convened in the miners' court in February of 1863. You see, it's not true though that there were no instruments of justice. There were. There was a miners' court. There was a judge, and of course, as you may know, in May of '63, before Virginia City had been discovered, but while Bannock was in full swing, there was an election there at which, well, there were 3 offices filled: a judge, and that was Burchett, a sheriff, and that was Henry Plummer, and the coroner's name escapes me right now. This was on the 24th of May in 1863. And it turns out that of the votes cast, Henry Plummer got a larger majority than either of the other two. So he was roundly elected.
Very popular.
Very popular. He was a respected man in the community.
Well, you know, a lot of the revisionist history, according to the authors of Hanging the Sheriff, really became stimulated in about 1958 with an article from Montana, the magazine of Western History, and it was called Afterthoughts on the Vigilantes, written by a history professor at MSU, J.W. Smir. And he begins his article by talking about how anyone whose mind is not stultified by romanticism is bound to admit that the history of the Montana vigilantes is very imperfectly known. This is something of a blemish on the writing of the state. Dimsdale wrote his little book almost a century ago. Langford came out with his more than 60 years past, and the writing has not been done since. The writing that has been done since has mostly been a reworking of these two authors. And then he goes on in a very scholarly way to pick apart Dimsdale and Langford, saying, well, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And
I contacted Dr. Smir.
oh, did you?
Yes, and I had a nice conversation with him, not only on the telephone, but a letter exchange. But that article was the last of his scholarly activities in the vigilante area, which is too bad because it showed great promise. He left Montana. He was actually here at MSU. I'm sorry, it used to be Montana State University, you see, but I misspoke, at the University of Montana.
Don't mix them up.
No, I
The
know.
Bobcat game is
Well, when
coming
I was here, it was MSU, right?
Oh, yeah.
You knew that?
No, I didn't.
Oh yes, this was Montana State University, and that thing over there was Montana State College.
Oh, I thought maybe it was a rodeo ground.
That too. At any rate, Smir was here at the time I was here. We didn't know each other, and Smir, he gave me permission to use his article on the internet. He said, yes, go right ahead. I'd be glad to see it put up on the internet for people to do what they want with it. So he was very, very accommodating that way.
And you know, you talk about the original descriptions of Plummer and his death, and let's talk a little bit about the mythology there. That he was the leader of a gang of desperados who had killed over 100 men, who had waylaid untold sums of gold, and by eliminating the sheriff, who was this double agent, you know, the person who during the day was enforcing the law of the territory, and by night was out with his kerchief over his nose, holding up stagecoaches.
Well, you mentioned that Smir criticized the writings up to that time, but there have been, since the Smir article in '58, there have been three interesting books published. One, Dan Cushman wrote The Montana Gold Frontier. Dan Cushman is, of course, famous for the book Stay Away Joe, one of the funniest books ever written. Dan Cushman's a famous, justifiably famous Montana author.
From Great Falls?
He is now in Great Falls, but he lived and worked in Dillon for a long time, and one time he worked for my uncle, who was I didn't know that until I met Dan Cushman in Great Falls, but Dan, while he was in Beaverhead County, interviewed some of the old-timers. This was in the 20s and 30s, and some of the people who still could relate back to the vigilante times. And he came away with the statement that, well, you know, some of the old-timers had more regard for Plummer than they did for the vigilantes, right? The other thing that he says, and I have a quote from Dan Cushman here, but that Dan says in his book, Montana, the Gold Frontier, the existence of any gang is doubtful, although the rough element knew who their friends were. A bandit organization headed by a single mastermind should have produced an example of organized banditry, but none can be found. And then another book that came out since the Smur article, in addition to the Mather and Boswell books, is the book by Art Pauley. And I have a quote from him if you'd like.
And that book is called Lawman and Outlaw. Henry Plummer, Lawman and Outlaw.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And he says, quote, there is no factual evidence that Plummer, in his position as sheriff, ever used his office to aid these felons in the commission of their crime. Now, these felons were people like George Ives, who very probably did commit murder, and whoever it was that was robbing the stages. Of course, you see, if you believe the popular versions of the Bannock story and the Plummer story, you'd believe that there were stagecoach robberies almost daily, right?
The way Dimsdale writes about
Oh,
it.
yeah.
He writes about it in this Gothic, elaborate prose.
And also, well, of course, it's been compounded by current writers because everyone's got to do a little better, right? So everyone has become an even better Hollywood scriptwriter, right? But when you go down and you really look at the evidence, there were exactly 2 stagecoach robberies in the whole time that Henry Plummer was sheriff, right? 2. And in each case, there were 2 bandits. No, in one case, there were 3 bandits involved. In the other case, 2. And they were not the same, by the way. And there was a total of $3,300 taken from these 2. And yet there were $10 million in gold taken out during that time and shipped.
Well, that was the real rub, wasn't it? That people were very afraid that they couldn't get these riches, that they'd come all the way to the frontier to mine back east. And they were very, very, very afraid that these roughs, that I can picture myself going out there and working really hard in the mines and then coming into town and seeing these guys in silk, the gamblers who were drinking all the time, never down in the cold water, never down in the mines. And I think there was that mistrust of the gambler and the people who had been in the other gold camps and made their way from California in '49 through to Idaho and Washington State, and finally when they hit at Bannock, coming up into Bannock.
Well, yeah, but nonetheless, do the arithmetic. What percentage verifiably, what percentage of the gold that was mined and shipped went to stagecoach robberies? Well, I have the figure here, but I have it in my head too, 0.0033%. That means out of every 10,000 cents of gold mined, 3 of those went to stagecoach robbers, right? And that's it. Yeah. Now, after the vigilantes had hung these people, there were some major robberies in that case. In fact, Cushman says there's more evidence of organized banditry after the vigilantes had done their work than there was before. There were some really very well-planned executions afterwards, right? Later in '63. I think that's an interesting thing that you just bypass.
Well, Langford talks about Plummer, and Plummer was a veteran of the gold strikes all the way across the Northwest, wasn't he? Well, Dimsdale says that there were too many stories on the origins of Henry Plummer to be able to pick any one story, that everybody had a story about where he came from, and he didn't tell the truth anyway, so there's no use in going back and looking where he came from. But we know that was sort of a cover-up, where Plummer came from, and scholars of today are pretty well agreed who Henry Plummer was.
Oh, there isn't any doubt that uh, Ruth Mather is a trained genealogist. She has a master's degree and worked as a genealogist with the church in Salt Lake City. She went exactly to the sources and verified that he was born in Maine in 1831, came from a farming and seafaring family, and exactly, she even knows what ship he shipped out from Boston on, and when he arrived in San Francisco, and traced him all the way through. Now, it's interesting that the Dimsdale-Langford version of what Henry Plummer did in Idaho in 62, well, they have him in Idaho already in 61, but he didn't. He arrived there in July and left in August. He was in North Idaho just a few weeks. So he could not have committed all the crimes that Dimsdale and Langford attribute to him.
Well, he did kill several people.
In the course of his career, you are right.
And he did serve time in San Quentin.
He did. He did serve time but he was pardoned. That's another fact. And it's interesting to me that the person who edited the Edwin Purple narratives, the diaries of Edwin Purple, who was an interesting character, is Kenneth Owens. And when he discusses the trial and conviction of Henry Plummer for second-degree murder, he states unequivocally that had this occurred today, Henry Plummer was a lawman at that time. He was town marshal. And there was a man out gunning for him, advertising, and went and borrowed a gun and stalked up the stairs, and somebody started shooting first. Whether it was Plummer or the other man, we don't know. But anyway, Kenneth Owen said, without doubt, this would have been a case of self-defense of a lawman. But Henry Plummer was a politician also, and he had political enemies, very strong political enemies, and he was done in. He got a bad rap and was convicted and sent to San Quentin. That's true. So that much is true.
And he was in the house with Vedder's wife at the time, and Vedder was coming up the stairs with a gun, and Henry Plummer, at least the jury, he's tried twice for this, right?
Yes.
And then the jury, the second time, convicted him because they thought that he shot first as the Vedder was coming up the stairs.
That's true. That's true.
And why was he in the house with the wife?
Well, he was in the house with his wife because she was a battered woman. She was her husband, Fetters, was a brute, had beaten her up several times, had scarred her up. She turned to various people in town for help. They sent her to the town marshal. Now, it was not a popular thing to do in those days to defend a battered wife. He did. And it wasn't only him, by the way, he happened to be in the house when Fetter came, but his deputy had been in the house just before that, and he had just relieved because they knew that Fetter was out after the wife, and it also threatened to shoot Henry Plummer, right? So, and she was due to leave, and they were basically guarding her, Plummer and his deputy. When Fetter came up the back stairs with a gun, and somebody shot first.
So he's sent away for that crime, but pardoned by the governor. And what happens to Henry Plummer after that?
Well, he never did regain his good name in the community after that, in Nevada City, California. He could not regain his old position as town marshal. There was too much suspicion against him. And he mined. He had mined before that. He had been interested in mining. He owned mines. He drifted on to Nevada to where the big strike, the big silver strike had taken place. He did not get in any shooting scrapes there, but nonetheless, he did get in a bit of trouble, drunk and disorderly trouble, so there's that about him. He then took off to the northern mines, and in the northern mines, he also again got into a shooting scrape, but the evidence there is that it also was strictly self-defense, right?
Yeah,
you can argue that, but the version that I believe and is documented from in the Sacramento Union, the newspaper, is that it was in self-defense. But that was, I think, Henry Plummer decided, this is it. I've had it.
So this was up in Florence, Idaho?
Yes, right, near
And
Florence.
then he got together with a man named Cleveland, right?
Yes, Cleveland kind of followed him. Cleveland was a desperado that tagged along with, and he was also with another fellow named Reeves, I think, and they decided that they would return to the States. Plummer was going. That was it. This was the summer of '62. That was before they knew about the Bannock strike. They did not come to Montana, incidentally, to go to the Bannock diggings. Came to Montana to go back to the States.
So they were going to Fort Benton.
They went to
take
Fort
the
Benton.
The ferry, yes. Not the ferry, but the riverboat back to St. Louis.
Yeah, it was already fall, so the riverboats weren't running anymore, but people were going down in what are called Mackinaw boats, built out of skins right there, out of buffalo skins, and they'd float down. Yeah. But they were strongly advised not to try that because the Indians were really up in arms, literally.
Yeah.
So
the fall of 1862, he came through the Missoula Valley, didn't he?
That's true. Yes, he did.
And passed through Hellgate and went out to past the Stewart Brothers settlement on Gold Creek.
Yes.
And the Stewart brothers mentioned him in their diary as a nice guy, a good
nice-looking guy, and they fixed his gun.
That's right.
They were gunsmiths, and they fixed his gun, and I think it was just basically the stock that they had to fix, right? He had a marvelous double-barreled shotgun, which was the envy of a lot of people, right?
And then he heads up to Fort Benton and realizes that he doesn't want to, it's too late in the year to make the trip back to St. Louis. And while he's in Fort Benton, he meets, I forget the man's name. But
James Vail. James and Martha Vail, they were sent up to open a farm, a demonstration farm, kind of a missionary thing, but government supported at the time, with the Pagans, with the part of the Blackfoot Nation, and that's what the Vails were doing. And they brought their Martha's younger sister, Electa Bryan, was her name, Electa Bryan. She came along with them, and you have to realize that in the fall of '62, there were not very many white women of any kind in what is now Montana, right? Respectable or otherwise, right? And single, apparently rather pretty women like Electa Bryan, she may have been unique, right? And Henry Plummer fell in love with her, and she with him.
Yeah, Plummer was in Fort Benton when James Vail came in and
That's
said,
correct.
It looks like there's going to be some trouble out at our mission. Would you come back and help us defend the mission for
That's correct.
several days?
Yeah,
so
that's what they did.
Plummer connected with Electa.
That's right.
Not at Fort Benton,
No.
but at Sun River.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Yeah, that's interesting. You know a lot about it.
You too, yeah. and then as winter started closing in, he decided to go over to Bannock.
That's correct. And Jack Cleveland followed him, which would have dire consequences.
Which was a bad idea, yeah.
Dire consequences for Cleveland, because Cleveland was gunning for Plummer, right?
And this was out of jealousy for Electa.
Some of it perhaps, but they went back to where, in California, where actually Plummer had arrested Jack Cleveland.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So they had history of bad blood already back there, and at any rate, that's another story of
In Bannock, yeah, and finally Plummer, Cleveland comes into the bar in Bannock and starts pushing the guy next to Plummer.
That's
Plummer,
right.
right?
That's right.
And Plummer says, "Take your hands off. Your argument is with me."
Mm-hmm.
And shots were exchanged, and Cleveland went down.
That's right.
And then the butcher, Crawford, came in and took
Yep.
Cleveland, who was still alive, back to his place.
Yeah, that's correct too.
And nursed him for several hours until he died.
He died, yeah.
And then Plummer was the myth is that Plummer was always suspicious that Cleveland had told Crawford the true story of Henry Plummer, and then that Plummer needed to eliminate Crawford in order to have a good reputation in
These were
Bannock.
myths that grew up after the fact. Nobody knows the true story of, but for whatever reason, Crawford was gunning for Plummer, and he did indeed shoot Plummer.
So
And he was not convicted, right? Because it was merely attempted murder, and he decided that the best thing to do was to leave town, Crawford.
So I think the prison record says that Plummer was known as a great gunshot and a gunman, but at this point he's the sheriff of Bannock.
At which point, no?
As he was shot by
No,
Crawford.
no, he wasn't.
This was before?
This was before.
Oh,
No, what author Langford says is that one of the authors simply says, after the scrape with Crawford, Plummer mended his ways and started started currying favor with the miners and with a view toward getting elected sheriff, which he did. No, there was a gap there.
I guess my point in there was that I think his prison record showed that he was crippled in his left hand, and then the ball from Crawford's rifle was broke his right wrist.
That's correct.
And then one of the balls from the shotgun pellets was still in his wrist. They didn't remove all of it. So
that's right.
Here we have a sheriff who, is reputed to be a great gunman, but has problems with both hands at this point.
But the other story is that he practiced assiduously with the left hand. And became quite good. But he really didn't need. He never used his guns after that. He functioned after he came back from marrying Electa, and that took place in June 1863.
So he's elected sheriff in
He's elected sheriff in May.
Back to Sun River.
Goes back to Sun River, spends a month. In the meantime, while he's gone from Bannock, Virginia City was discovered. So he wasn't in on the rush there. Mm-hmm. He was over waiting to be married by a priest. The Vail family insisted that he be married by a priest, by a minister.
Yeah, they were Protestant.
They were Protestant, but
they wanted a minister, but the minister didn't come upriver because the boat.
That's right. The minister didn't make it.
Had an accident,
and
so they went to the priest.
They went and they got the priest to marry him. And it's interesting, I believe. I haven't really looked in. I mean to do that, but it's got to be one of the very first marriages between a white man, white woman in what is now Montana. I think there is one more. I can't remember now the date of it, but it's got to be one of the very first among not more than a handful of marriages, right?
So June 1862, he brings...
June 1863.
1863, okay, sorry. Brings Electra back to Bannock because he's the sheriff. He can provide for her. They build a house, they build a cabin for her, and then all the trouble starts in Bannock.
Well,
because
no,
he's
there
killed
wasn't.
in December that year.
No, he's
right?
killed in January, January 10th, 1864. No, there wasn't any trouble in Bannock. In fact, that was quite a happy time in Sheriff Plummer's life. He was functioning as sheriff. There's all sorts of archival evidence of things he did, of writs that he executed, of the first sheriff's deed given in Montana, bears the signature of Henry Plummer. The deed, for example, when Sidney Edgerton came, Sidney bought a house at a sheriff's sale because so many people moved away. They had to sell the houses at sheriff's sale. And Sidney bought a house and paid the court. And Sheriff Plummer signed the deed to him, for example. He was well respected and well liked, by the way. He was active in the Union League, which was supporting the Union side.
Now, this was during the Civil War.
This was, of course, during the Civil War, right? And there were lots of Confederate sympathizers. But he was active on the Union side, although he was a Democrat. And, for example, in August, the U.S. Marshal from Lewiston came over, Payne, and wanted to get somebody nominated for Deputy U.S. Marshal for the east side of the mountains. So he went to Langford and the Union League. Langford was head of the Union League, and said, will you submit a name? So Langford said, we'll have a secret ballot. And there were 30 members of the Union League. Well, it turns out that the unanimous choice was Henry Plummer to be appointed Deputy U.S. Marshal for east of the mountains.
Which is a move up from sheriff
Well, yes.
to U.S. Marshal.
But
Deputy U.S. Marshal.
Langford refused to submit the recommendation, even though it was an overwhelming choice of the 30 members of the league, and he wouldn't abide by it.
So trouble starts there.
Well, bad blood between Langford and Plummer starts right there. Yes, that's for sure. Although neither one of them ever attempted to shoot or try to, do any damage, but there was bad blood, no question.
There was a quote in Langford's book about that. You remember that quote where he talks Plummer? He actually quotes Plummer. It's one of the only quotes we have of Plummer.
Yeah, how was it? I will never have anything to do with you again.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, we've been good friends,
Yeah.
or we've actually been polite to one another, but from this point on,
I'm your sworn enemy or
I'm your
something.
sworn enemy. Those are harsh words.
Yeah, that's true. Langford's interesting in a lot of ways, of course. He claims he has this, all throughout his book, there's this current of how bad things were and how it was so unsafe to get on the trails between Bannock and Virginia City. That's a distance, by the way, about 70 miles, right? And, would take a good horse along, many hours to go there. And, of course, with wagon trains, you couldn't make it in less than a day, right? Now, Langford was in the business of hauling lumber from a sawmill that he had by Bannock over to Virginia City, which was a new, in terms of Bannock. Bannock was already a year old.
Yeah.
And Virginia City was the new place,
they needed
right?
that lumber for
They needed lumber
estates, and they needed it for cabins,
and
for everything.
Langford needed it to make money, right? Langford was a merchant that, got rich. But anyway, Langford says he made 30 trips between Bannock and Virginia City.
Which is 70 miles.
Yeah, made 30 trips in the fall of 1863 without incident. Now, what does that say about organized crime? It's probably not much more. It's not much safer right now to go from.
Yeah. Well, there's this quote from Michael Malone and Richard Roeder's book, Montana: A History of Two Centuries, which is the most used. My understanding is the most used history book in high schools now for Montana history, and those two describe Plummer as a person who, quote, combined in one unstable personality qualities of charm and intelligence, but also of psychotic viciousness.
It's interesting that Dr. Malone could be such a insightful psychiatrist to see that he was psychotically vicious at this distance. That's not what the people who knew him reported. Not at all. There are all sorts of reports, personal reports of him as being helpful, as being generous, effective, intelligent, there's no question about, right?
But not a psychotic or a psychopath.
He probably, the only incident that Malone could use to support that would be the shooting of Jack Cleveland. But don't forget that Cleveland had been around boisterously proclaiming that he was out to get Plummer. And people did this, these desperados, like, they did shoot each other.
Well, if you touched your gun in anywhere in a public place, it was an open invitation to gunfight.
Oh, yeah, and it happened. So...
Well, I want to go from what you said about all these remarks that people have brought down in their journals and elsewhere, that Plummer was this urbane, helpful gentleman, always well-dressed, one of the handsomest men in the territory at this point, they say. Very fastidious about his appearance, to the fact that, while these comments are being passed down, there's also something else brewing. And that breaks after George Ives is tried in Virginia City in December 1863.
Well, I don't know what you mean by something brewing. George Ives, as you know, was not hanged by the vigilantes. George Ives was the last of the real trials in the territory. He was tried in miners' court. The prosecuting attorney was Wilbur Sanders. I forget the defense, but there was a defense attorney. There was a jury. There was a jury vote. He was convicted, and he was hanged, right? And you might say that was due process. Whether he was guilty or not is another question, but nonetheless, it was due process, right? It was after that the vigilantes decided to form and go after anybody that had been associated with Ives and go after them, right?
Within 20 days, Plummer was dead after George Ives' trial, right?
That's true.
So,
and yet, nobody had a real suspicion, as I can see it, of Plummer up until the time that the vigilantes hanged their first two victims. That would be Red Yeager and a George Brown, two young men who had been flunkies around the camps and around the bars there. They were not known to have ever robbed anybody or committed any crime, but they were associated with some with Ives in a sort of a sense. At least one of them is a bartender, and the other one was a kind of roustabout over at the Rattlesnake Ranch between Bannock and Virginia City. Right?
So they hanged those two men.
They hanged them and said that Red Yeager confessed and named a whole gang of people. But that confession does not exist. That if it indeed it had existed, and if it had been written down, someplace it was destroyed, or as Mather and Boswell conjecture, it never did exist. But we don't know that. Now, all we know is that there is no record of that confession, so-called confession of Yeager, which was the first finger of Henry Plummer as the leader of the gang.
That was from that point on. The vigilantes took off in various directions.
No.
Whether it was a Bannock group that went down to Bannock, and wasn't there another group that went up toward Deer Lodge?
Not at the same time. They did the Bannock thing first. They did the sheriff and his two deputies at Bannock first.
Let's talk about that then. Those were the next killings after Red Yeager. Those were the first killings after Red
Yes, Yeager and Brown were the first two, and then the next three were at Bannock on January 10th, 1864.
Okay, so earlier you mentioned how the myth of Plummer trying to get the gun to fire on the vigilantes was not correct, that he was at his sister-in-law's house, and it was actually the cabin next door to the person who had been appointed.
Next door to Wilbur Sanders.
Wilbur Sanders.
Wilbur Sanders was the nephew, of course, of Sidney Edgerton, and had been the prosecuting attorney at the Ives trial.
And Edgerton was appointed by Lincoln as
to become Chief Justice, but was not in fact Chief Justice, because he never went to Lewistown to be sworn in. So he was nothing. There was no justice system in that part of the territory. Okay, so there was nothing official. The only justice system was the miners' court, which had been convened in Virginia City to try Ives. But the vigilantes destroyed the miners' court system. It ceased to exist. I don't know where we were. We got off the track a little bit.
There was a knock on the door at Plummer's sister-in-law's house.
Yes.
Who was there at the door?
Wilbur Sanders was not at the door. It was some other deputies, some other vigilantes, and Plummer did not suspect anything. In fact, Plummer suspected that they wanted him to come down as sheriff and take care of a prisoner which had just been brought in. That would be so-called Dutch Wagner, Johann Wagner, also known as Dutch Wagner. He had just been brought in as a suspect in an attempted robbery. Attempted, I point out. And so Plummer thought that he was going to go down and arrest him and take him and put him in jail, right? But instead, they surrounded him. And he yelled out, "But gentlemen, you know me better than this. There's no reason for you to do this." And he said, "Let me talk to Wilbur Sanders." Wilbur Sanders was here, was listening to all this.
He was in the crowd.
No, he was in his house.
He was in his house.
And he yelled out, "Men, do your duty." Wilbur Sanders had been a colonel in the Army. He said, "Men, do your duty. Forward, march." Which they did then.
And they took Plummer and his deputy.
Well, they went and got the two deputies, and they took them up to the gallows that, in fact, Henry Plummer had built. And hanged them there. That's right. Yeah.
So now we come to the real question about, in your opinion, what was the motivation? If the gang was the myth, and Henry Plummer was popular with the people in Bannock and Virginia City?
I think although I think the gang is a myth, I believe that there were those in the vigilantes that did not think it was, and that thought it was real, and thought that there was an organization, so that they acted out of fear. I would suspect, right? Some of them acted out of a self-serving motive, also, though, without a doubt. But that's another matter, and that would be pure conjecture on my part, of course.
So fear was the major motive. The fear of losing their wealth.
Well,
road bandits.
Yeah, fear of an organization and a that could carry out these various crimes, and yes,
And after Henry Plummer and his two deputies were killed, they went into Virginia City before dawn. Was that 2 days later? 3 days later?
Those were the next hangings. Those were the Virginia City Five.
They captured 5 before dawn?
I have a chronology, but I don't. I'd have to check it out. But it was, immediately following, they took the Virginia City Five.
Unfinished building, the Hangman's building in Virginia City, and
right.
one by one they stretched their necks.
Now, you mentioned Boone Helm.
We don't have much time. We have about 2 more minutes. So.
Well, I just say that certainly they hanged Boone Helm, and certainly Boone Helm had in his lifetime been a criminal, a very nasty criminal
They say he
at
was a
times.
cannibal, too.
He had been a cannibal, right? But at any rate, they hanged him not for what he did in Montana, but for what he had presumably done before he came to Montana. I think that has to be said.
And then after those 5 were hanged, they moved out into the countryside. They came all the way up into
Of course, there were
Hellgate, and they came to the Bitterroot Valley,
hangings
too.
right here. There were three hanged right here in Missoula, right? They pursued them here, and they didn't need any crime. A person didn't have to really have any crime. They just had to be accused of being a member of a gang. That's all they were done. Now, if they were accused of that, then it was a foregone conclusion that they would be hanged.
Richie, could you put that website address up? This is Lewis's website address. If you're interested in the vigilantes and this history, and you want to go back through the documentation, take the time to get into this website and explore on your own. And then there's another thing that you mentioned before we started our conversation on television about a comparison between the level of violence that took place in Montana at that time and the violence that had taken. The same kind of gold strikes occurred elsewhere, but under different circumstances.
Yeah, the comparisons between the Idaho-Montana gold strikes and the violence and the vigilante actions and British Columbia. Now, British Columbia was a crown colony governed by a governor out of London, had a magistracy, had a judge and a constabulary, not elaborate, but it was there. And whenever there was a crime, messages were dispatched, and a magistrate appeared with a constable, with a policeman, and held court, and the criminal was tried and whatever, convicted or turned loose, and given just this much presence of a real justice system in all of British Columbia, and it was comparable to the size of gold rushes into Idaho and Montana, there wasn't a single vigilante action of any kind and not a single lynching or hanging. And it's also demonstrable that the population of miners was very much the same in the two areas.
Well, I want to thank you, Lewis. That's a good note. That's a good note to end on. I want to thank you for taking your time and applying your intelligence to this material, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Jeff. It was a pleasure.
Thank you all for joining us. We'll be back sometime later. Thanks, Rich.